I just wanted, early in my career, I started out in the oil industry, and I worked for a company called Schlumberger. And what they did is they put tools down the oil industry's holes that were drilled to tell them whether they had oil or gas or not. And I thought I'd start out with a quick, crazy story. I was also a engineer or a geologist for Shell Oil, exploration geologist. So working on the rigs is an experience, and the roughnecks are characters. And I remember working for Schlumberger, we had this thing called a pill, and it has radioactive material in it. And so what we do is we have a 6-foot rod, and we would clamp onto that and pull it out, and it had a lead barrier to protect us from the radiation. So when we took that up on the rig and put it in the tool, which went down in the hole, we could tell the oil companies from the reflection of the radioactivity what kind of rocks and whether they had oil in their hole. And to protect the roughnecks, I would go up on the derrick every time and I'd say, look guys, I'm going to bring this radioactive material up there, up here. Please leave the derrick, and because I don't want you to get injured. And every time I would go up on the deck, the derrick, they would be there. And I asked my operators, the guys that work for Schlumberger that set up the equipment, I said, why are these guys still staying up there after I ask them to leave? And they said, well, they see you with it, so they assume that if it's okay for you, it's okay for them. Of course, they don't know anything about the lead. So I thought, I got to figure out a way to get those guys off of there, and they're big guys, so you really don't want to mess with them. So I said to them, I said, when I come up here, this is radioactive, and it's going to make you all sterile if you stay up there on the rig. And by golly, the next time I went up on the rig, there was nobody to be seen. So, well, I'm going to talk today about hydraulic fracking. It's known better as hydraulic fracking. Next slide, please. And it starts out with just a drilling of a normal well. And we've been doing this for hundreds of years. So let me go into just a brief discussion of how we drill these wells. This is a carbide tungsten tri-bit core, or tri-bit, and tri-core bit, I mean. And it attaches to a 30-foot pipe, which then goes down in the hole, and you can attach another 30-foot pipe. And the derrick actually spins the pipe so that this tears away at it. And if you, next slide, and if you look at how this works, this is the drill pipe. They pump mud down this hole. Now, mud sounds scary, but really all it is basically water and clay, and it's made food grade so that when they drill through the freshwater aquifer or the water table, they don't contaminate it. And then the mud goes down here, and it cools this off, the bit, and it also makes a lubricant, and then it brings the rock back up to the surface that the bit crushes, and then a geologist can stand on the surface and they can tell where they're drilling and what kinds of rock. I want to emphasize, though, that in the drilling industry, we've been doing this for hundreds of years. I say we, I haven't, but the oil industry has been doing this for 100 years or more, and everyone knows where the fresh water table is. It's between 300 and 1,000 feet. And when they get down, there are very strict rules. When the oil company drills below the fresh water, which is in usually a permeable rock like sandstone, they stop drilling, they pull the drill bit out, and then they come in and they put what we call surface casing, which is a carbon steel casing that fits in, and then they pump cement, which goes up and around the casing, and then they let that cement dry so that it's all protecting the aquifer. And then they're required to do a pressure test, to make sure that that casing is protecting the water table. And then they even drill a little bit further after they have the casing in, and they pressure test again, of course, with some government official nearby to make sure that this aquifer is protected. And then the other thing to point out is that usually they're drilling down to greater than a mile deep, so more than 5,000 feet away from the aquifer, if you will. And so any concerns that people might have about the freshwater aquifer being protected, believe me, the oil industries do not want to pollute the freshwater table. So next slide, please. So this now is about the fracking part of it, and I want to show you how this is done. This is created by the Environmental Protection Agency. They have a whole report on the safety of using hydraulic fracturing. And believe it or not, once they have the casing set, it's done just like any other well. And once they have the casing set, this I find amazing. I'm not an engineer, so this kind of stuff really amazes me. They can turn that bit so that it drills horizontally, and it'll go out. And they can also drill many holes from this well. They could drill this way, they could drill into the screen or out of the screen. And so you can drill many holes from the same well. And then once they have the well drilled horizontally, they come in just like they did at the top, and they can put casing in, which is all kind of a mystery really on how the engineers can do this. And then they even cement that casing so that you've got a completely cased and cemented well all the way to the surface. And then they take a gun, that perforating gun, it has explosives on it, and you can see in this blow up here, they actually blow holes in the pipe and the cement. They're only a couple inches long. And then that permits, they blow those holes all along this horizontal place. And I should say that after 100 years or so of drilling, we're very clear as to where the oil shales are, and that's what they're after when they frack. Oil shales have not been able to be produced until 1997. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Oil shales were known to be very, very full of oil, but no one could drill into them and produce them. They sure tried, but they didn't. And the hydraulic fracking fluid is made up of 95% water and sand. And what they do after they perforate, they send that water and sand down into the hole under hydraulic pressure, and it fractures all along the well here out into the shale. And that fracturing only occurs about 300 feet around this oil, so they're not getting outside of the shale. You don't want to frack any of the rocks above and below the shale for the simple reason that you might hit water above the shale or below the shale, which will get into your production. And the sand is in the water to help keep these little fractures open. They're only about 0.2 centimeters in width, but it's enough to start producing the shales. Now, shale is an extremely porous rock. It can handle as much as 80% oil. The problem is that none of those pores are connected. So we were never able to produce it because of the impermeability. But the fracturing of it makes it flow and connects all of those tiny holes that contain the oil. So for the first time in history, in 1997, we were able to produce oil shales through American technology. Now, there are some problems. They have a 0.05% additives that they put in here, acids, chloride, isopropanol. You wouldn't want to drink this stuff. And when they start to produce the well, this water some of the water comes up. They originally put in anywhere from 1.5 to around 16 million gallons of water to frack it. So it takes a lot of water. And when it comes back, about anywhere from 15 to 50% comes back up to the surface. And they used to take this water and pump it down old wells that were no longer producing. But now, because the water is so precious, they take it off to treatment plants for the most part and reuse it so that we're not losing or not losing as much water as we used to. So again, this Environmental Protection Agency study was to help us protect the system. Oh, you missed one there. No, go back. One more? Okay, I wanted to, yeah, that's right.
Sorry. I'm not very good at this.
Well, we got some excitement ahead, it looks like. Well, the fracking revolution started, we've been fracking since 1947, and most people back in 1947 when they started this, they were just fracking wells in sandstones to help it produce, because after a while the pressure goes down and you can't take any more oil and gas out of the well. So sometimes they would go in and frack it to help it continue to produce more. But in 1997, Mitchell Energy out in West Texas at the S.H. Griffin number 4 well decided that they would try to frack the oil shale. They were lowering their production rates on other wells, and so they were getting kind of desperate to find new oil. And this fella, Nick Steinsberger, was an engineer from Mitchell Oil, and he had the idea that maybe fracking the wells, they could get the shale to produce. Well, they made a mistake when he sent a fracking company out on the well, and they had used a not so viscous fluid. Usually they fracked wells with fairly viscous fluids. And he noticed that fluid that was not viscous actually helped the production of the shale. He thought, well, you know, I'm getting a little bit of oil and gas out of this well. So he talked to company. Everybody thought Mitchell Energy was crazy anyway for trying to produce an oil shale. And then Nick got him even crazier when he said, look, I'd like to frack this with water, being a very non-viscous fluid. And finally the company relented, but everybody thought he was crazy, I kid you not. And he fracked that well with water, and it produced copious amounts of oil and gas. And now these fracking wells can produce oil and gas for 20 to 40 years. So through American technology, we've actually learned how to produce these oil shales, which were completely off limits to us. And believe me, most of the oil in the world is in these oil shales. So the future of the industry has completely changed now. Well, let me see the next slide, please, Susan.
I can do my one job.
Okay. I'm paying her thousands of dollars. One of the big problems with the fracking industry has been, and I'm trying to keep this short for y'all, so I won't go into the details, but this is the earthquake distribution. Prior to 2008, it was blue, and then after 2008, it's red. And as you can see, these are fracked wells in the red. All of a sudden, around 2009, we started getting all kinds of earthquakes in the central United States. Now, they were greater than three, and a little bit greater, you can feel the shaking. You get around 5, it starts knocking things off of shells. So there was some concern about all this earthquake activity, and I use the term radical environmentalists. I'm an environmentalist, but I think there's a group of environmentalists that are fairly radical. And they tried to claim that the fracking was actually causing the earthquakes. But the fracking does not cause the earthquakes. The USGS and the Environmental Protection Agency, this graph is a USGS graph, went out and studied this fairly carefully. And what was causing the earthquakes was taking the water out of the wells and injecting them in old wells. That water would go down deep, and it would slick up old faults underground. And those faults then would move easier because the pressures are so great underneath the ground. It created these earthquakes. And as soon as they started doing regulations to prevent the injection of water into the ground, they started seeing a drop rather quickly in earthquakes. So the fracking industry was not creating earthquakes due to the actual fracking. It was due to the injection wells. And they've been able to now get on top of that particular problem. Next slide. Okay, so this is definitely not something you want to happen when you turn on your faucet. And this was actually happening in some areas. The gas was coming up the outside of the casing and actually getting into the aquifer. And some people could light their water on fire. And this woman was very happy to show us all how that happened. Now, The environmental people were right. This was caused in a few cases by casing being improperly set. That's why I talked a little bit about the casing. Early on, when they started fracking wells, which really didn't get going until the late 2000 or around 2008 or 2009, Mitchell Energy tried to keep it a secret, but it got out. And so everybody started fracking. And some companies that really weren't rule conscious created bad casing, cementing casing. And of course the technology was ahead of the rules and regulations. Finally it caught up. The last thing an oil and gas company wants to do is to pollute the aquifer, because it costs them a lot of money and they lose a lot of their gas. So those companies that did this, it cost them a fortune. And I believe from all the lawsuits, they went out of business. So now we don't have, I know of no cases where the environmentalists are screaming about this kind of thing. So we've ended that problem too. And finally, as far as problems go, next slide, yeah. There was a big brouhaha about methane gas being produced, leaking from the storage containers that the oil companies did. And this is, I think, an EPA, yeah, you can see Environmental Protection Agency graph from a study they did in 2016 or 2015. And you can see that methane was not leaking. They showed that it wasn't leaking, and that methane gas in CO2 equivalents, they just report methane by converting it to CO2, not actually converting it physically. They report it as CO2 equivalents, and you can see methane gas is actually maybe even decreased a little bit since the fracking is taking place. So we don't have the methane pollution and oil companies don't want to lose their methane. They make money off of this. So they're very careful not to have leaking going on. If they're leaking, somebody's going to get fired. So this is not a problem anymore. Now I want to tell you, as an environmentalist, that I'm all for not adding more of these gases to the environment, and I think the oil industry is very concerned about that also. Next slide. Well, here's the good news, and that is, and this is the last slide, some of you will be happy to know that. The oil industry, and this is a slide of oil, but I could show and it'd be a mirror image of this slide. Oil production in around 1985 peaked in the United States, and it declined all the way to about 2007 or 8. And Mitchell Energy drilled in 1997. The word got out somewhere in here, and all these fracking wells then started fracking oil and gas. And look at how our oil and gas production has increased. We have now become the world leader by far in the production of oil and gas through good old American technology. And we are no longer now dependent on Arab oil like we were back in here. And the great news is that the United States is now the leading reducer in global warming gases. And those global warming gases are, I think, and most scientists think, are causing global warming. So we've got to try to reduce. But the big polluters are China and India, and the United States is one of the least impact, because we've been reducing our gases, global warming gases, dramatically. And the reason primarily for that is we've switched over from coal to gas and sometimes oil. Gas is not only less expensive than coal, but it also doesn't pollute the atmosphere as much. So we've been able to go down in our pollution of the atmosphere, and our contribution to global warming has gone down. For some reason, radical environmentalists don't want to understand this process, but we are, I think, should be very proud of this. And I would say, as a reasonable person, I think that we've got to kind of make this balance between not destroying our economy because we want to switch over quickly to clean energy, and keep the oil industry going so that we can protect our economy and at the same time clean up the worldwide geothermal energy problem. So I want to thank you very much for having me here today. I enjoyed it immensely. Any
questions? Or why are people, if this is all good, there's got to be a bad because there's so many no fracking in my area signs. Why don't people want you to frack?
Well, the state of New York has actually banned fracking in the state. And honestly, it was all of the bad news that came out when they started fracking in 2008 and 2009. In fact, there were several people that went out, radical environmentalists that went out and made very, very critical films. Rightfully so in some places. You can see when your faucet catches on fire, there's a problem. So I think that's really what gave the whole fracking. And then they had the problems with the earthquakes, and that got a bad rep from that. So I think you've got a good question. I think that what's got to be done now is for the oil industry to somehow convey that fracking is no longer has associated with it the original problems that we had. And believe me, the rules are very strict now. And I feel bad for New York. The taxpayers there could be subsidized by the oil production. So the state of New York is really missing out on a lot of tax money. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I didn't.
Russia
Yes.
has dramatically increased their production, looking at that chart. And they're almost equal to Saudi Arabia.
Right here, yeah.
Are they doing fracking? Is that the cause or reason for the dramatic increase in their production?
Russia has been blessed with a lot of natural oil. So most of that oil has been just from their great reservoirs. But there's no question now Russia is fracking. And so are a lot of other companies. You can see here, this is the old Soviet Union. They never reported oil, so they started reporting here. Then they had a big drop. Yeah, the Russians didn't like to give information to the West back then. So yeah, good question. Russia has become a major player in the oil industry. And also, I'm almost certain they're doing a lot of fracking. Yes.
How about the reserve?
Oh my gosh, what's been wonderful is that we know where all of these shales are underground because we've drilled hundreds of thousands of wells. And so we know precisely where they all lie. And overnight people became millionaires because they were owning, the old oil companies own these oil shales, and then we can now go in. So reserves, although I would say reserves have never been a problem, it's just been harder to find reserves. The reserves have opened up. We can have fossil fuel production certainly throughout our children's lifetimes, in my opinion. You had a question?
Yeah, you might have said it and I missed it. How do they get the drill to make those kind of turns if you're dealing with a 30-foot piece of pipe?
I'm going to beg off of that question because I honestly don't know.
Okay.
And I'm not even going to touch that. That's a mind-blowing engineering feat of all kinds. I think when you, I'm just guessing now, but I think when you get to those depths, the temperature, it makes the pipe a little more plastic so they can direct it.
Gotcha.
But they also put on, I think they use GPS somehow or some device which tells them precisely where they are. Amazingly, you remember those fires in, who can forget them? Saddam Hussein blew up all the wells and started on fire. Well, they were able to drill down in some of those instances and pinpoint hit those wells and pressure them up to keep them from leaking at the surface in some cases. So it's amazing what they can do with these pipes. And I'm afraid, when I work for Shell, I let the engineers handle that. I wasn't even going to get near that stuff. But I am always impressed. Yes, ma'am.
Where